Welcome to the Astrology as a Strategy podcast. Today I am going to talk about how you can spot if you are going through a rough Saturn phase and what 3 signs you need to look for. Saturn is very often shown as the bad guy, but it is also the planet that really shows up for you to be realistic and practical. Now, I want to start with an example of what recently happened in my life, how it ties into these Saturn cycles, and how I really understood what was going on. I was laying on the bed and I was nursing my 21-month-old, and all of a sudden my hand moved to my belly and I started to feel extremely sad. I really felt this wave of emotions just coming over me. And I just had to think about the miscarriage that I had 7 years ago and how that left such a deep scar in my heart, in my womb. I felt it in every fiber of my body. That was a very, very dark time for me. And it was hard to heal that part. Even to this day, there are still scars that are painful. I know over time, the pain will get less and less. But it was everything around it that made it such a painful experience. At that time, we were still living in Thailand, but I was visiting my parents in the Netherlands. My brother was going to get married, and I had to go through it all by myself. My husband was still back in Thailand. He just had this amazing spiritual awakening, which was really beautiful for him, but it made it harder for him to connect to the earth and the reality that I was in. So that was a very lonely time. And it honestly took me many years to make peace with it and what happened and to not blame myself. Also, I think miscarriages are still such a taboo subject and it's so hard to talk about it. That's why I'm very openly sharing this. So I'm hoping that if you're going through something hard as well, to share this with the people around you. But the reason this came up for me specifically 7 years later was because I'm going through another Saturn cycle. And actually, honestly, I had to look it up just to make sure that Saturn cycle was approaching. And it was. This is what we often hear is the 7-year itch. It has everything to do with astrology and it has nothing to do with astrology. This is something that in society we're very used to saying. When a romantic relationship, things are starting to break down, we often just say, hey, wait, that's the 7-year itch. And then you get to decide, is this relationship worth fighting for? Or is this a moment to realize, hey, I need to let go of this? And it's such a beautiful way to look at this Saturn energy. So Saturn takes about 29 years to go around the zodiac. So every 29 years, it returns to the same spot that it was when you were born. And these pivotal moments in your life are often important beginnings or important endings. Now, I know when you're listening, think back of when you were around 29, 30 years. I can't say it exactly because it depends a little bit about when you were born, and Saturn goes into retrograde very often, so I cannot pinpoint it exactly, but it's around 29, 30 years. Think about that. What were you doing? What happened? What shifts happened in your life? I also see some entrepreneurs online who are approaching their Saturn return, and there are so many signs and signals that you can see there is something big going to happen in their life. They're going to make some major decisions. And I know when you're listening now, you probably can think of a few major decisions that you made around the age of 29, 30. But that's not where it stops. And now we'll explain a little bit more about that 7-year itch. So if we divide it in 4 phases, that's when we get the 7 years. Every phase is a new type of energy. And you can think about the 4 phases in the moon cycle. So when Saturn returns, it is a new moon energy. Then around the age of 36, 37, we have the opening square, which is very similar to a first quarter moon. Then around the age of 43, 44, which also happens to be a very strong Uranian influence. But I won't go into that because that would be too technical. But then we have Saturn in an opposition. Then around the age of 50 and 51, we have the closing square, which is very similar to a last quarter moon. And then around the age of 57, 58, you have your second Saturn return. Now, in mythology, Saturn is called the Lord of Time. It makes you very aware of the time passing. It makes you aware of what is behind you. And that helps you to prioritize. Saturn is very patient, is a lot about effort. It's also very realistic and practical, which can come as a bit of a shock when you are living in a fantasy world. When I was 29, I wasn't necessarily living in a fantasy world, but I was living in Thailand. I didn't have a job. I didn't start my business at that time. I was living in this bubble of just enjoying life and not really seeing many responsibilities. We were just getting by. We were having a lot of fun. And that miscarriage brought me back to reality instantly. My oldest at that time was about 1.5. And it really showed me where my priorities were. Not in that moment, because it literally took me months to understand. And I think it, in the end, was also a catalyst for me to start my business. Not that I had to have that miscarriage, but at that time, for me, it really helped me to see things from a different perspective. To not just look at the world through rose-colored glasses, but to also see the reality for what it is. And what is coming back right now for me, this isn't happening in my body, but it's happening in my business. I need to take a lot of decisions in the next few months because of the growth that I'm experiencing, the expansion. There are very important things that I need to start letting go of. I need to start prioritizing in a different way. And that's why my body was responding to this. My body was making the connection before my mind even made the connection. And this is what I want you to start paying attention to. So the first sign that I want you to see and look for is when you feel like you're on the brink of a breakdown or a breakthrough, because these look very similar. A reason why most people don't get past the first 5 years of business is because they feel like there's a breakdown, but actually it is right before the breakthrough. And I'm going to be completely vulnerable and honest here that a few weeks ago, I almost wanted to give up. Now, also, that was right before a full moon and right before I got my period, which might have something to do with it too. But it all felt so heavy, so many decisions to make. And it just felt hard. I also have a husband who likes being in Holland but doesn't love it. He's still trying to find his way in the Dutch society. And he's struggling. So it's hard to see a husband who's struggling, me having to take care of all of the back end things in the family. And that is forcing me to prioritize what I am going to do, what I'm going to hire people to do for me. what I'm instructing my husband to do. There's a lot of things right now that are happening that need to shift and change in order for me to be able to grow in the way that I want to, as a person, as a mother, as a wife, as a business owner. There are so many things that are coming together right now. It almost feels like there's so many responsibilities. I just don't want to do it. I just want to run away and say, nope, I'm not here today. Also, don't make these decisions around the full moon or before you have your period. Just wait, which is always a good idea. The second thing I want you to pay attention to is to be aware of similar patterns that are showing up that you had 7 years ago as well. Like I mentioned, for me, 7 years ago was very much around the death and rebirth part, seeing the cycle of life, really. And right now, it is again this closing down, starting up of new things. But it happens in a different area of my life. It happens in a different field of life experience. And it's really good to start paying attention to where do you see the similarities. The third sign I want you to pay attention to is that you can see how to prioritize and you will know what things to let go of. Now, just as a disclaimer, this doesn't mean that it's easy. Just because you can see it and feel it doesn't mean that the actual decision is any easier. Probably it's actually a really hard decision. Because what Saturn does, it really shows you what works and what doesn't. It helps you to sort through your life, to prioritize, and let go of the things that don't work. But it does it in a very realistic and practical way. So you cannot run away from the reality because it's really just pushed into your face. And that's not easy. That can be a very painful and long process. But you know deep down that you are experiencing it. You know that you are going through this phase. So to sum all three of them up, the first one is you're on the brink of a breakdown or a breakthrough. The second one is you're aware of the similar patterns from 7 years ago. And the third one is you can really see what to prioritize and what things need to be released. It's a really good time to prune your projects, your life, your business. And think about it. If you prune a bush of roses, they will bloom even more beautifully because you have cut out what is not needed anymore. And it's so important to go through this process over and over again on a continuous basis. That's why in my private podcast, we have a weekly reflection moment where we reflect on the week so you can keep up with things, prune when it's necessary. Because when you wait for these 7-year moments to do the big pruning, it becomes even harder. Now, like I said, I'm in the middle of a huge pruning and cutting down, weeding everything out period in my life right now. But because I have kept up all the time, it is easier to see the patterns. It is easier to see through all of the limiting beliefs and see the signals. Because I could have ignored the fact that I was laying on the bed and instantly I was brought back to that moment when I had my miscarriage. I could have just thought, well, okay, this is a painful memory. Let's just release it. But I didn't. I used my curiosity to go a bit deeper. What is this showing me? What is this telling me? It is telling me that it really is time to let go of things. I held on emotionally to that pregnancy very, very long. Even when I got pregnant with my second, I still felt the emptiness. And I don't want to go through that again. in my business. I don't want to go through feeling the grief and the sadness and trying to hold on to things because I'm scared to let go. I want to go into this new phase of my business feeling confident, feeling light, making sure that all the things that are not working in my favor are either automated, or I eliminate them, or I delegate them. That's it. So for you, I want you to think about what phase that you are in. And think about that 7-year cycle. Think about that 7-year itch. Where do you see it show up? What is it telling you? And I love to hear from you if you're currently going through one of those 7-year itches, one of those 7-year cycles. And even if you're not the age that I mentioned, it might be that, for instance, if you started your business, let's say 7 years ago, that you might go through that cycle as well, even if you're not, let's say, 36 or 43. You might be in between those ages. But if you started your business 7 years ago, you might actually go through this cycle as well. So think about it. Where do these cycles show up for you? And I'd love to hear from you. You can send me a DM on Instagram and let's explore. What does this look like for you? You can also share this podcast episode, tag me on Instagram, and see what your insights were. Because Saturn is not something to fear. Saturn is here to help us. So if we allow Saturn to show us what needs to be prioritized, how to be more realistic, it helps us to get ready for the next phase. That's it for this episode. I look forward to hearing your insights and what you've learned from this episode, and I will speak to you again very soon.